This is the second video of Unit 3.1 of International Economics, where I'm going to be discussing and explaining and talking about the theory of absolute advantage. So the learning outcomes are: explain the theory of absolute advantage and explain using a diagram the gains from trade arising from a country's absolute advantage in the production of a good or service. So let's get started. Basically, absolute advantage is a situation where a country can produce more of a good or service using the same amount of resources. So if one country can produce more of a good or a service than another country using the same amount of resources, we say that that country has an absolute advantage. Or it can produce the same amount of a good or service using fewer resources. So essentially, it's two sides of the same coin. It's either you can produce more using the same amount of resources or produce the same amount than another country using fewer resources. What's the source of absolute advantage? Why is it that it exists? Well, it exists because countries have different factor endowments. Countries are endowed with different factors of production. Some countries have a very large labor force. They're endowed with very large, plentiful, and cheap labor. Some countries are endowed with a lot of natural resources, a lot of fertile land that allows them to have an absolute advantage in farming. Some countries have a higher level of technology. All of these things contribute to a country's absolute advantage. So here's a situation where we are looking at two countries. We've got Italy and we've got France. On the y-axis, we have the production of wine measured in bottles, and on the x-axis, we have the production of cheese measured in tons. You can see that France produces 7,000 bottles of wine and 800 tons of cheese. Italy produces 5,000 bottles of wine and 200 tons of cheese. You can see that France, in this case, can produce more cheese and more wine than Italy. So we say that France has an absolute advantage in producing wine and cheese compared to Italy. So here's another example where we're looking at the United States and China. Okay, the United States can produce 1,000 books, while China can only produce 500 books. The United States can produce 1,000 units of clothing, while China can produce 2,000 units. We can see that the United States has an absolute advantage in the production of books, and China has an absolute advantage in the production of clothes. If there is no trade, the United States will produce 1,000 books and China will produce 500 books. So we only have 1,500 books. And also, the United States will produce 1,000 units of clothing. China will produce 2,000, so we have 3,000 units of clothing as a world economy. But if each country specializes in what it has an absolute advantage in and trades with the other country, the United States will be able to produce 2,000 books, double that amount, because it'll take all those resources allocated to the production of clothing and will put them in production of books. So now the world economy has 2,000 books. China will be able to specialize just in clothing and will produce double the amount of what it produces, and then the world economy will have 4,000 units of clothing. So you can see that if countries specialize in the production of goods or services where they have an absolute advantage, everybody wins. There's more of that good or service available for the world economy. Next video, I'll explain the theory of comparative advantage.